You're listening to the Restoration Podcast, conversations of hope and healing. Join us as we talk about subjects dealing with ministry, faith, everyday life, and other hot topics. Our prayer is that these conversations bring encouragement to your life. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to today's episode. I want to give you a little bit of background on Dr. Jim Bradford and his connection to Restoration Church. Pastor Jim Bradford currently serves as the lead pastor at Central Assembly in Springfield, Missouri. The reason we know him personally is because when Tori and I were living in Springfield, Missouri, we attended Central Assembly. Pastor Jim is unique because he is armed with a bachelor's degree in Aerospace Engineering and Mechanics, a master's degree, and PhD in Aerospace Engineering. Pastor Jim bypassed a career at NASA in favor of an opportunity to pursue God's call in his life into vocational ministry. Through the years, he has pastored multiple churches and also served as one of the 4 executives who lead the Assemblies of God National Office. He is a highly sought-after teacher who is called on to speak all around the world. We were super thankful that Pastor Jim gave us some of his time. He shares biblically based counsel on how Christians should act during an election year, how we can help unite the church rather than divide it, and also touches on why millennials are leaving the church, and much more. You'll be encouraged after hearing this conversation. Here's Pastor Jim Bradford.
Sure, so grateful.
Well, thank you again for giving us your time. I know you're a busy person, so I'll try not to waste too much of your time.
Oh, no problem. We're good.
But usually when someone's on for the first time, what we usually like to do is let them kind of share their testimony or their ministry history. And many of our listeners, actually, this may be the first time they hear of you or hear you. And so could you just take a few minutes and share your ministry history, maybe share about how you got called or where you got called, and maybe where you've pastored and served thus far?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, thank you, Aaron. It's really good to talk to you again. I grew up in a Christian home, Spirit-filled home, and during my young years as a child and as a teenager, I loved Jesus, but I also developed a real love for science. And I joke I probably watched Star Trek too much when I was a teenager. But I ended up pursuing a secular education in aerospace engineering. When I was 26, I finished my PhD in aerospace engineering from the University of Minnesota. But during those graduate school years, about 3 years before I graduated, a little Bible study I was leading on campus, affiliated with the Assemblies of God Chi Alpha ministry. We had a spiritual breakthrough. We grew from 12 to 65, then 100. So I decided to stay at the university, in that university community after I graduated, sort of lived by faith financially, and became the full-time pastor of that, campus pastor of that group I'd been leading as a student. And a year later, we took 120 out of that group and started a university church. It's still there all these years later at the University of Minnesota, Sojourn Campus Church, and is being led by one of my students from way back there, who is a math major. So I guess we're keeping everything in the nerd world.
Yeah, math and science.
But, yeah, exactly. And then from there, after we became a church, I pastored that church for another 8 years. We bought property in the university, right by the University of Minnesota. And then I ended up moving to Southern California, where I pastored a church, much larger, multi-generational church, for 12 years. Followed Dr. George Wood, who later became like a lifelong mentor to me. He passed away a couple of years ago. But, that's where that connection. He later became the general superintendent of the Assemblies of God nationally. But we met there. I followed the church he had built over 17 years. And that was not an easy assignment, but a wonderful assignment for a young leader. I was 35 when I went there. And then I'd grown up in Canada and moved with my dad's company, had moved us when I was in high school to Minnesota. But I just had this sense I'd go back to Canada someday and pastor. And that door opened up after I'd been in Southern California for 12 years. So we went up to Vancouver, British Columbia, still on the West Coast, and pastored one of the historic Assemblies of God churches up there, the Canadian Assemblies. And that the surprise of my life was we were only there 3 years, but it was a wonderful time. It was kind of a turnaround time in that church's life, and halftime event, I think, in my life. It was very formational. And then where I am now, Central Assembly called us, and we ended up making a move in 2003 to pastor at Central Assembly. By this point, my mentor from Southern California, Dr. George Wood, who I'd followed as a pastor, was now in the national office right next door to Central Assembly here in Springfield, Missouri. So they had a vacancy in the general secretary position, one of the officers. So he asked me if I would do that. I agonized for several days because I love being a pastor so much, but I ended up leaving Central after being here about 5.5 years and going and being a general secretary for nearly 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the surprise of my life was they had another pastoral change at Central Assembly towards the end of, a little before COVID, actually.
Right.
While you were attending the church.
Correct.
Here, Aaron. And Pastor Jeff left after a number of years at Central. And so they asked me to come back and be the interim pastor. And one thing led to another. And I eventually shed the general secretary position and came back full-time here. So that's a long story to a short answer. But,
no, it's all right.
But starting at the University Church and then 2 churches on the West Coast, and then the place I always said I'd never live, Springfield, Missouri. Here we are. It's been over 20 years now.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what's amazing to me about your story, and I've heard it before, you've shared it from the pulpit, is that you, like you said, you were a science guy and you studied science, but little did you know that the Lord would call you to full-time ministry for decades, right? Yeah. That's just kind of how the Lord works. The Lord's really great at changing our assignment, And
my 5-year plans have never worked for some reason, and so I call it God's sovereign surprises. But
I like
that's
that.
exactly what happened.
I like that. Yeah, same here. I'm in Sioux City, Iowa. If you would have told me when I was in high school down in Houston, Texas, you're going to be a full-time worship pastor, first of all, I would have said, stop right there. No way. But if you would have completed that sentence, Sioux City, Iowa, I would have been completely thrown off. But that's how the Lord works, Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
I had shared this with you, and I'll share it with our listeners. The first time I heard you preach was in 2011 at National Fine Arts. It was our general council, and you spoke one night, and I remember being blown away by that message. I still remember the text even from Exodus chapter 33 to this day. And and my sister was an evangel grad, so she knew Springfield people. And I asked her, she was like, how was fine arts? I said, it was great. I said, the service we went to, there was this awesome preacher. His name was Pastor Jim Bradford. I said, do you know who that is? And she said, yeah, he's the pastor at Central Assembly. And so when I went to be an evangel student and I was looking for a church to call home, I immediately went to Central because I was like, I want to hear Pastor Jim every Sunday. And as you know, I got there, you were not there.
I was gone.
You were on your different assignment. And but what's funny is little did I know that I'd be called to stay in the Springfield area. And then eventually, as you just said, you'd come back. So eventually I did get to hear you almost nearly every Sunday. It was just kind of funny. But
and you were really active you were huge in our worship team, and then COVID hit, and I'm going, wow, I get to come back and pastor just in time for COVID. And we had to be online, and I still have memories of watching you as one of our worship leaders online. You are such a help to us. I love your voice, but your spirit as well. And I'm grateful you did come to Central, because it was for such a time as this back in 2020, 2021.
No, I appreciate that. That means a lot. And I'm thankful that the Lord called us there too, because it was because of my time there that I learned how to do what I do now under the leadership of great leaders like Jason Salazar and other people. I learned how to do my job. So it was, again, a sovereign thing, sovereign timing, But thank you. I appreciate that. But I wanted to give you an opportunity on our podcast platform to do what you do best, and that is share scripture-based counsel. Mm-hmm. And so, living here in America, we're really blessed with the freedoms we have, However, our country has had its fair share of divided times, and, it seems like today we see more and more of that creep into the church, sadly. This year is an election year, which can greatly escalate this. But my main question to you, I wanted to pick your brain a bit, that science brain, right, is how can we as Christians today help unite the church rather than divide it? And what does the Bible have to offer to say about this?
Yeah, You know, I'm about to start a series this fall on the Sermon on the Mount on Sunday mornings. And
Perfect.
I just felt partly that's it. But, this is, I kind of know when I sense the Spirit of God leading me to, launch a series or something. But partly it is because it is an election season. It is very divided. And part of the Christian life is experiential. We get saved, baptized in the Spirit. The Lord sets us free from an addiction, just forgives our sin, gives us peace. I mean, those are all experiential things that are part of the Christian life. But there's also an ethical dimension to the Christian life. It's not just experience. It's not just how I feel in a worship service Sunday morning, or whether the preacher inspires me. That there is a way of living, and that's partly why I've been fascinated with the Sermon on the Mount. But there is a way of living that God calls us to. And you see this reflected in Paul and Peter and other of the New Testament writers. The ethic of the first century in the Christian church was that they endured persecution and they loved even their enemies.
Right.
And so, first of all, I think, like what happened in the Olympics last week and things, I referenced it, but I didn't make a big deal out of it. First of all, persecution is supposed to be expected of us if we're standing with Christ.
That's right.
And to overreact to it, to just start, isn't our world terrible and everything? Well, yeah, it is terrible. We all know that. But Jesus didn't say, your enemies, those who curse you, those who hurt you, those who persecute you. He said, bless them back, and not start. I think there's a place in a free country like America to stand up for our rights, to litigate for freedom, to elect people who represent our values. But the fact is, that's not where the real battle is. That's not how. Jesus is going to come back and set up his kingdom. And meanwhile, we're the ones who endure wrongdoing and yet still love people. And Jesus said, they'll know you're my disciples if you love one another. So I think we need to be careful in terms of some of our rhetoric. And then, we've got to counter this cultural narrative that says, if you disagree with me, you hate me. And that's a huge inequality there, but we've made it an equality. And it's getting harder and harder just to have a sane conversation with people. So you look at the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5, which is a character description of Jesus. I think the Sermon on the Mount in some ways unpacks what the fruit of the Spirit look like in real things in terms of how we look at people, how we react to people, our need to retaliate or not retaliate, all these things. Love, joy, peace, kindness, patience, goodness. These things mean we can have a conversation with people without getting all upset if they disagree with us, without shouting at them, without arguing them down. We're crucified with Christ theologically. We're crucified with Christ. That means I don't need to win every argument. I just need to love people and their eternal souls and share the gospel. You can, if you believe there's policies that are harmful to the country and you're talking politics over Thanksgiving dinner, I mean, be careful. In our family, we keep politics out of Thanksgiving dinner. Personally. We'd rather have harmony and peace. I don't need to win every political argument if there's a guest at our Thanksgiving dinner table or whatever, who may be of a different political persuasion. I would like them to know Jesus. And I think we harness our tongues. We use gentleness, kindness. We answer. Peter says, he writes to Christians who are really exiled. He calls them exiles, and they're being persecuted. But he said, talk to unbelievers in a way that's knowledgeable, so you can give a defense of your faith, but it's also respectful and kind. And this is from the Sermon on the Mount to the fruit of the Spirit to everything that first century Christians were supposed to be known for. In a very hostile environment, it was kindness and respectfulness, clarity, but with kindness and respectfulness. I think if we model that, it all starts in our own little world, in our own circles of influence this week, and the people we interact with.
Yep, that's right. I know you're not really on social media. I know you have a Facebook or whatnot, but
Yeah.
I this comes to mind because when I'm on, I constantly see exactly what you're talking about, the disagreeing and the divisiveness and the not so Christ-like language. And what's surprising to me is a lot of this is coming from people who claim to be Christians, right? And
So, yeah.
it's really heartbreaking. And as you just pointed out, if we just, look at the fruits of the Spirit and look at Jesus' example and counsel, we would know that that's exactly opposite of what is expected of us as Christians. And I think the other thing to remember as well is that, before we are whatever our political party is, our identity is in Christ. And
Yes,
if anything,
exactly.
that is the best way to unite the church, Of
Yeah,
course, amongst every church, no matter what denomination, no matter what state you're in or what area you're in, if you're in the Bible Belt, if you're on the coast, your congregation is most likely not all affiliated with the same political party,
exactly. Yeah,
However, we are all affiliated with the same Savior. You know what I mean?
exactly.
And so that's pretty
Yeah,
great.
yeah,
I think some Christians also can take the road of, well, how can I support a president or a councilman or a whatever, a mayor, a governor that has these stances and whatnot. But
hmm,
to my recollection, when I read the Old Testament, not every king made the greatest decisions.
right.
And was still on the throne, and God still used those narratives to bring Him glory. You know,
Yeah, exactly,
um,
exactly. Yeah, he doesn't. And he named Cyrus
yes,
150 years before Cyrus became the Persian king, and he said, "You don't know me, but I'm going to use you. You're going to be my servant." And so, and Romans 13 does say that God, and you got to understand, the Romans ended up killing Paul,
mm-hmm,
executing him. But
mm-hmm,
in spite of that, he said, we ought to respect government leaders because they bear the sword in order to keep some semblance of law and order,
right,
to protect innocent people, punish guilty people. And yet, I mean, the Romans were tyrants. I mean,
mm-hmm,
they were cruel, vicious, immoral to the max. But he said God still raises up civil authorities to keep an order in society.
mm-hmm,
In 1 Timothy 2, he said he actually does it because he wants all people eventually to come to Christ. And Paul realized that the Romans had built the Roman roads. They unified that part of the ancient world in the Greek language. And their kind of iron-fisted Pax Romana, the Roman peace that they were imposing, did allow Paul to travel through large parts of the ancient world, which might not have been possible if there hadn't been a strong governing Roman authority,
mm-hmm,
even though the Romans persecuted them and were idolaters. But the civil government had built roads and created safe boundaries to cross for Paul to travel extensively. And he appreciated that, and
mm-hmm,
so he would always say, you got to be careful. And the reason you do that is exactly what you said. Our citizenship is in heaven.
yeah,
We're not, if we are followers of Jesus, we're not ultimately Republicans or Democrats or Libertarians
right,
or third party people. We are citizens of the kingdom of God, sons and daughters of God. People will say to me, well, I can't pray for our president because I just hate him.
hmm,
And I go, uh, you know what? We're bigger than that.
right,
We belong to the King of Kings.
right,
And he told us to pray for all the
yeah,
leaders and to love everybody
yeah,
and to stand up for truth when we need to. But that's it. Yeah. I might say to your listeners too, be careful the pressure you put on your pastor because there are both Republicans and Democrats probably in your church.
yeah,
And you, everything I read right now is that if you want to grow your church fast, you take a position on one side of the political aisle or the other, and you preach it hard. And then people online will see people talk about pastors like me who I try to stay non-political in the pulpit, just talk
mm-hmm,
about moral issues.
just biblical, yeah,
And they will call me spineless. Not me personally, but
hmm,
just pastors like me.
right,
They'll just call me spineless because I'm not willing to stand up for Donald Trump or whatever,
right,
or for the Democratic Party and the justice issues that they feel are so lacking yet in our culture. So
right,
I, you know, there there's some good in both parties. So you preach about justice and you preach about family values and
Mm-hmm.
sexual morality, but I don't tell people how to vote.
Right.
And be careful not to put that pressure, because you take a position, like in parts of the country, it's 50-50. You take a position and you've alienated half your community
Right.
who will have to look through politics before they see Jesus.
Oh, that's good.
And that is,
Yeah.
do not put your pastor in that position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You've been a pastor over different congregations for many years. Have you ever seen a time as divided as this? Would you say the current times we're living in it's pretty heavy, the division?
Yes. I, I would say this is the worst, to be honest. And, for years, like for probably 20 years, every presidential election, I hear people say, this is the most significant election
Right.
of our
They use
lifetime,
that line.
or there'll never be a more important election
Right.
like this. And if so and so loses,
Yeah.
we'll have no country in a few years. Well, they were saying that. They've been saying that for years and years and years.
Right.
So that's just rhetoric you expect at this time. But at a level lower than that, we are truly at a crisis point in terms of our polarization,
Mm-hmm.
our disunity. It's dividing churches, which again, we're people of the gospel. We got to be above them. We're not defined by
That's right.
these
Yep.
worldly categories, even political categories. But I'm really concerned about this, and I think social media combined with people being holed up at home during COVID, we've seen an acceleration of a lot of very toxic things in our culture that are dividing people, and that are putting people's voices. I was looking through my YouTube a little bit last night, just kind of scrolling, and
Mm-hmm.
man, there's everybody saying everything on there,
Oh yeah.
and then one YouTuber tearing down another
Yeah.
YouTuber. I, you know, we need to read the word and pray
Yes, that's right.
and invite a neighbor over for dinner or something.
That's right.
We gotta do something for the kingdom of God and not get in this quicksand. But it is fueling hatred. I've never seen hatred, division like I have now in all my life.
Same, and I'm only 30, but same. I haven't seen as many presidential election years as you have, but it's pretty significant. And what concerns me most is, like you said, the polarization of our world. But what concerns me is the division that, like I mentioned earlier, that's creeping into the church as well. And like we've been discussing, we are not identified by that through that. We are to be the most united. And you mentioned someone that said, "Well, how can I pray for the president if I can't, I hate him." Well, our young adults recently we spoke out of the passage in Luke where Jesus talks about loving your enemies. And what I would say to that person is, well, Jesus, if he were here, he'd say, well, especially pray for that president that you hate.
Yeah.
And it's so hard it's a hard thing to practice. And like you said, we are persecuted as Christians. If we're not, we're probably not doing it right. You had a great saying you used a lot from the pulpit about if you're claimed to follow Jesus, but it's not costing you anything I can't remember the exact wording. If it's not costing you anything, or if it's not affecting your calendar, you're probably not doing it right.
Right.
Something along those lines.
Yeah, something like that. Following Jesus has to cost us something, and we have created in the church an idol of comfort, convenience, everything that has to be my way. And that morphs into an obsession with our rights.
Yeah.
And, in a free America where we do recognize the freedom of religion, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of speech, a lot of countries, you can't advocate for rights. It's just a whole different system.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't advocate for rights here. I just worry that we get too obsessed with our rights, and then we're just reacting to persecution negatively rather than staying proactive. Right.
Yeah, and I love what you said too. Is rather than post on social media or take down a fellow YouTuber, we need to read the Word. We need to pray.
Yeah.
Which I also want to add that we're not sitting here saying that social media or YouTube is evil. There are some great content pushed out there, godly content.
How I keep track of a lot of things, actually.
Yeah. Speaking of which, you have a great podcast called the Jim Bradford podcast. And
I
I
just like the title of it, but that was the only thing we could think of.
That's funny. Well, it got my
But anyway,
attention, but I'll put a link in the description to that. But it's
oh,
I
thank
so
you.
I haven't followed it since its inception, but I fell upon it recently, and it's
Hmm.
amazing.
Oh,
Currently
thank you.
you're diving into each book of the Bible. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah,
We started with Genesis, 66-week series, 66 books of the Bible, one book a week. Yeah.
and it's
It's
pretty
about a half
fascinating.
hour podcast. Yeah.
Right. And so if you're listening and you're wanting to go deeper into the word, maybe gain some more understanding, maybe some background, some history, that the Jim Bradford podcast, currently what they're going through is great. Is that all y'all do on that podcast? What were y'all doing before? Was it always biblically based stuff,
Uh,
content?
yeah, I wrote a book on leadership for pastors and volunteer leaders in a local church. It's called Lead So Others Can Follow.
Right.
And so the first 50 or 60 podcasts were a slow walk through the topics in that book.
I didn't
Talked
know
about
that.
spirituality, strategy,
Wow.
skills, and then stamina. Just kind of a cross section. It's not a long book, but we did take 50 or 60 weeks to do that. And then we went through the pastoral epistles,
Hmm.
First and Second Timothy in some detail, at least First Timothy. And then we started back at Genesis. So the last kind of third or more of what we've done in the podcast has been this book by book, week by week journey. And we'll soon have recorded through the end of the New Testament. We're getting there now.
Wow. Yeah, I love it. It's great. It's on my
Thank you,
library,
Aaron.
and yeah, and just a tip for people listening in or watching. As we mentioned earlier, there is a bunch of junk and lies and negativity out there. But if you fill your mind, you fill your spirit with positive
Right.
things based on the word, you will see a difference, in how you see
Exactly.
others and how you want to treat others. But I'm glad you brought up that book because I actually read that book.
Oh, you did?
Yes, lead so
Oh,
others
yeah,
can
the lead
follow.
book. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And I read it because I was trying to set a New Year's resolution. I don't remember which year it was. We had moved here, and I'm like, I want to read more. And I said, I'm going to alternate. I'm going to alternate between a spiritual help book, a spiritual book, something that'll help me with my
Uh-huh.
pastoralship or my spiritual life personally, with I call it a leisure book, like nonfiction, because I love those too.
Good.
I'm a
Yeah.
science
Right.
nerd
Good.
too. Okay.
Yeah. Sure.
And
Yeah.
so I kind of alternated. And so the first one I read was your book, Lead So Others Can Follow.
Oh,
And I
wow.
just have to say it really affected my leadership and my outlook on leadership. So I wanted to thank
Oh,
you for
thank
writing
you.
that. And so I had a
Thank
couple
you. Thank
questions
you.
about it, and I'm glad you brought
Yes.
that up. So what prompted you to lead the book? Was there a need? Was there how did you come about writing this book?
That's a funny question because when I wrote it, it was like 10 years ago.
Uh-huh.
Uh, I, at that time of my life, I thought the last thing we need in the Christian world is another book on leadership.
Right.
That was my belief. Yet I
Yep.
kept feeling something scratching at me that I was supposed to write something. And so I was spending like part of a day, a morning with the Lord or something. I was at home in my in our family room in the basement, and just kind of thinking, reading scripture, praying. And all of a sudden, it's like I saw this outline in my head,
Mm-hmm.
like in front of me, and it was the outline to that book. And so I grabbed something to write on. I wrote it down, and so stuff doesn't always happen to me just like that. But
Right.
in this case, and I'm not saying it's an inspired book by any means, but I just felt like the Lord was prompting me. You need to write on leadership, and in some ways was taking. I was general secretary at the time,
Right.
so I was traveling nationally, doing leadership conferences with pastors. In some ways, I felt like I just need to actually write down some of the things I'm teaching. But I just saw this outline, it organized around those four areas, and uh, and I nobody like I didn't know how it would get published. But even if it was just a Word document on my hard drive on my
Right.
computer, I just knew I was supposed to write it. So I wrote it. And during the process, the Assemblies of God, and the people I was working with figured out I was writing something. And so they looked at it and they decided to publish it. So but it was at a time where I felt like we don't need more books on leadership.
Yeah. And
One of
then you
my
read a book.
passion, yeah, and I wrote about it. One of my passion, the only redeeming factor in my mind was um, I do have a passion for making sure our spirituality stays integrated with our leadership.
Right.
And sometimes, got this whole leadership world and then this whole spirituality world, and they're separating right now in the church. And I, I do have a heart to keep our spirituality hardwired into our leadership. I think that's, in the pastoral, or if you're volunteering in a local church, that's what it's all about.
It's a great book. And again,
Thank you.
it really did help me uh, see my leadership in a different way, a biblically
Thank you.
based way. And I need to go back and listen to the start of that podcast. I didn't know that. That's awesome. That's
Okay. Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah.
And not to open a different can of worms, but something that just came to my spirit just now. You were
Yeah.
talking about leadership in the church and spirituality, which of course the two go hand in hand, but sometimes, that doesn't happen. And there's recently been a lot of pastors and church leaders who stuff has come to light that has not been great for them. They've had to step down.
Yes.
And so, real quickly, just a question here off the rabbit trail. Do you have any idea why that keeps happening? It seems like every day I see a new headline of a new pastor that's had allegations of this or that, and they have to step down.
Yeah. Um, oh boy, there's a couple of reasons. I think. Let me make a very overall
Yeah, sure.
statement. I think, you know, um, the scriptures in the New Testament say judgment starts at the house of God, and I think that God's kind of cleaning house right now.
Yep.
It's stuff that's there anyway because we're carnal, broken people, but it's being exposed. I think that's part of it. I think also the rise of the mega church,
Yes.
large church. I pastor a large church, but um, that rise kind of deifies leaders and isolates leaders
Right.
from other people. I think a lot of people are raising the question, what is it about us as evangelicals that really want narcissists to lead us?
Mm-hmm.
And I probably shouldn't say that, but it feeds, if you have narcissistic tendencies and you're a high dominant leader, the large church feeds all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But it also isolates you. And you don't have a lot of accountability, and your leadership style is often very controlling. You're
Right.
bossing people around.
Right.
You will find where there's personal moral failures. Sometimes there's also abuse, not sexually, but just spiritual abuse in their leadership styles, the way they treat people. And it's because you get deified. Congregations put you on a pedestal. They tend to like narcissists, and the narcissistic personality profile, it has nothing to do with the fruit of the Spirit or the humility in servant leadership Jesus wants us to walk in. And I think in some ways we're reaping what we've sown. So.
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head. We had done an episode a couple weeks ago discussing that, not that much in depth, but that's kind of what came up was that we're living in the age of celebrity pastors. I hate saying that.
That's it. Yes,
but
celebrity pastors.
It's totally a thing today. And again, back to social media, it's so easy to access their content. And
easy, yeah.
And that's kind of what helps them rise as well, I also want to say too, similar to this topic, not to get too off topic, but I'm a millennial, and a lot of people my age are leaving the church at an alarming rate. And there's this term that is being popularized. It's called deconstruction of faith.
Yes.
And a lot of people in my life who have left the church and say I'm deconstructing my faith, it breaks my heart to say this, but a lot of them had said it was due to spiritual abuse, a bad negative experience in a church, a toxic environment of a pastor leadership doing exactly what you just said, bossing people around, and it just got out of control. And because of that, now they've left the faith. And I have no statistics on this. I don't look anything up, but I'm assuming, this is just a guess, I'm assuming if a person who was raised in the church gets hurt by the church, I'm assuming it's a lot harder for them to step back into the church. That's just my guess,
Yeah, some are. I'm starting to hear about increasingly reverse deconstruction. I have some millennials, as you know, on my pastoral staff team.
Yes.
And they've helped me understand a little bit that there's deconstruction, then there's deconversion.
Yes.
And deconstruction is dangerous, of course, but
Mm-hmm.
it may help you think through and own the faith for yourself and separate Jesus from a toxic organizational system.
Mm.
And if in the process you can separate those two and find Jesus again, your deconstruction might not mean you totally deconverted,
Right.
but I would say the majority of people who seriously deconstruct do deconvert. Some people who are deconstructing are just deconstructing church life, not necessarily
Yes,
Jesus.
that is true. Yes.
And yeah.
Yeah,
I
that's
got a
popular.
missional friend that I love. He leads all kinds of missionary endeavors to unreached parts of the world. And he said, he said, you know what, one thing, and hopefully deconstruction brings us this. He said, we tend to stare at people and glance at Jesus.
Hmm.
What we really need to do is stare at Jesus and glance at
Wow,
people.
that's good.
And, at some point, you're negative. The people who hurt you in church, the abusive pastor, the narcissist who just keeps leaving dead bodies behind the bus.
Yes,
Yeah,
I
you,
understand.
right. At some point, you really still need to wrestle with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And the more we stare at him and just glance at people, I had to decide years ago, because I've seen a lot of failures in ministry and people, and I've had people disappoint me, even hurt me. But I had to make a decision. Am I going to let their behavior dictate my belief system,
Right.
or am I going to go back to, did Jesus really die and rise from the dead? Does what he says about how humanity ought to thrive in selfless sacrificial love, um, is that worth trashing?
Mm-hmm.
Or isn't that the highest value system in the universe? The power of sacrificial love. That's what Jesus embodied. And I'm not going to throw that away. And I'm not going to throw a personal relationship with Jesus away just because of how somebody did or did not behave.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to, that was my version of deconstruction.
Yes. No,
I never did lose my faith in Jesus, but I had to make that decision. I'm not going to let someone else's behavior make my decisions for me.
Right. That's good. Yeah. And you're correct. In that the millennials that deconstruct, it's with the church, not always with Jesus.
Yeah,
There's a
yeah.
big movement among people my age and younger that they love to use a line, I'm religious, but I'm not a church person, or something like that.
Right. Yeah,
And
exactly.
and it hurts because because that means the church is not doing what the church is supposed to be doing, right?
Right.
Or at least the ones they went
Exactly.
to, you know.
Yeah. Or even if they are coming back to church or somehow staying in the church, I notice they want something more authentic,
Yes.
something more relational in their
Yes.
church experience, and they want something less hyped and produced.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a boomer, I'm an aging baby boomer.
You said it,
We
I didn't.
invented
Yeah.
hyped and produced.
Yeah.
We kind of invented the megachurch, actually. But, the high performance, that's one thing I love about the way you lead worship. And we're trying to do this at Central. We're trying to do it with excellence,
Yeah.
but stay short of that line of being overly produced,
Sure.
overly hyped, but rather, can we engage? And one of our metrics are not how good are the people on the platform, it's can we hear people singing in the congregation during worship,
Mm-hmm.
for instance. And then I will preach to them. And I also want to know how you're treating your family when you go home from church. These are the things. And I think it's bringing us back to good things. Be more relational, be more authentic.
Right.
I think what millennials are looking for there are helping us as a church.
Yeah, you're exactly right on that. Millennials, especially, and younger, our youth pastor has a great line he uses. He always says, "Young people are looking for real. They're tired of the fake. They're
Right.
tired of the fake, and they want something real. They want something
Exactly.
authentic." So you're
Exactly.
absolutely right. I had a few things written from back to your book that I just kind of wanted to pick your brain on. Of course, in the opening of chapter 1, I don't know if you can remember the last time you've read your own book. Do you read your own books?
It's been a while.
But in the opening of chapter 1, you share this great story here about you stood in front of your congregation and you made 5 commitments to them. And I wanted to ask about this. You said, I'm going to read the first 3. You said, I want to be a spiritual leader. I want to be a growing person. And I love number 3. You said, I'm going to disappoint them somehow, sometime.
Right.
Why make
Yeah.
that commitment?
Okay.
That's my
We'll
question.
start with three.
Yeah.
Start with three. Yeah. Um, I thought, look, this is a relationship, expectations. If you're going through premarital counseling, in part, you deal a lot with what are your expectations of the other person? Are those realistic expectations? And every relationship wrestles with expectations, and none of us are superhuman that we can meet another person's total expectation. We just need to understand what they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was trying to just right size that. What I did say was to the congregation, I don't know that I put it in the book, but I said, you know what? I'm going to disappoint you. I may not going to address an issue that you think I should. I may not make a leadership decision that you totally agree with.
Right.
But at the same time, you know what? You're going to disappoint me too. I'm going to call a prayer meeting and hardly any of you are going to show up to it. I literally said that.
Yeah.
And just to try to say, look, so I said, so let's face it now and get over it.
That's good.
We're going to disappoint each other.
Mm-hmm.
So a few months into being here at Central, a guy came up to me. He was trying to be nice. And we had made a decision of some kind as a church, and it had something to do with a TV program and funding and all this. And he said, well, you're keeping commitment number 3. So
Oh my
that
gosh.
became code for people. Instead of I
That's
disagree, they just said, well, at least you're keeping your third commitment.
That's funny. Oh my goodness. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
But
Pastor Jim,
it did help, to be honest about that.
to let that
I
out
think.
out of the gate,
Right.
right? Rather, again,
Yeah,
going
right.
back to the real and fake, we're human. We're all going to fall short.
Yeah,
The word says it.
exactly.
And those of you listening, if you're looking for a perfect church, I've got bad news. You're not going to find
Yeah,
it. Every church
exactly.
has its flaws,
Every church does. Yeah.
But Pastor Jim, before we let you go, I just want to again thank you for giving us some of your time. I know you're busy. You lead a congregation. I know you do other things. You preach other places. You teach. Do you still do preaching other places like conferences and councils? Do you do that?
Yeah, some. Not as much as when I was um, general secretary, because that kind of was assumed in some of that job.
Right.
But yeah, I still do. I do a lot with university ministry yet. Some of the God University ministry, especially, and speaking at some of our Christian colleges. And then I do probably the bulk of what I do is investing in missionaries overseas and leadership stuff now. So, and I do some here in the U.S. too.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a pastor, so I can't guest preach very much in other churches. But
Right.
my calendar is full enough, and the church has been really wonderful to allow me to travel. And I've got a great staff team that kind of runs day-to-day operations. So yes, not as much as I used to, but as much as I can handle right now.
Right. And then you are currently the lead pastor at Central Assembly.
Right.
Are you a part of any other organizations or boards? I can't remember.
Yeah, there's a senior adult community all the way to nursing care called Maranatha Village in town, and a number from Maranatha attend our church. I'm on the board of that.
So,
yeah.
And then does Evangel have a board of trustees? I can't remember.
Right.
And
yeah, and I was on that for years.
I remember you being part of that.
Yeah, and I did the presidential. I led the presidential search when Carol.
Okay,
Taylor
very good.
came.
I remember you had some relationship with Evangel. I just couldn't remember what it was. But you mentioned Maranatha Village. I don't think you ever heard this. I don't mean to talk. I know you're our guest, but there was a couple that I met there. I won't say their name, but they attended Central for many years, and it was my first year at Evangel, and I play French horn, as you know, and I wanted to own my own. I wanted to own my own horn, and they're not cheap. And so I was searching, and then I saw an article, either in a newspaper or something, a local man selling his French horn, and I met him, and it was this gentleman, the husband of this couple. At the time, I didn't know that they were connected to Central, but anyway, long story short, I played on the horn, I liked it, and he wanted $1,500 cash. Now I'm a freshman at Evangel.
Yeah,
I do not have $1,500 in my bank account or cash.
Right.
But to condense the story, we were kind of back and forth all year. He was having trouble selling it, and I really wanted it. And my mom was like, well, see if he'll take payments. We can do that in a year. And he said no. He wanted it all at once. And so then after a while, I did what, pray without ceasing. I prayed. I said, Lord, I believe you gave me this ability to play horn. provide, you know. And so after one of our orchestra concerts at Evangel, he approached me and said, "You know what?" He goes, I'll take payments." And in the moment, I was
Oh,
like,
wow.
"Wow, the Lord moves fast." But the Spirit guided me to say no. Have you ever been there where the Holy Spirit guides you to do
Yeah.
something, prompts you to do
Right.
something you don't want to do
Yeah. Yeah.
a few times? And so I was
Yeah.
like,
Oh, yeah.
"Yeah."
Definitely.
I said, "I have to say no." Well, then it was the morning of my jury, our big final test at Evangel my freshman year, and I get a phone
Hmm.
call from this man. He calls me. He said, "Are you still interested in that horn?" I said, "Absolutely." And before I could let him talk, I said, "I can't afford it." And I'm never going to forget these words. I'm getting chills thinking about it. He responded. He said, "Well, what if I gave it to you for absolutely free, for free?"
Oh, you're kidding.
And I
Wow.
said, "Can you repeat that, please?"
Yeah.
And then his next sentence I'll never forget either, word for word. He said, "The Lord told me I had to give you this horn. It had to be you."
Oh,
So
praise
later
God.
that day, I met him. He handed it over. I tried to give him all the cash I had. He refused it. I said, "Sir, thank you so much." And he said, "No, don't thank me. Thank the Lord." And
Man,
that actually flourished into a very unique bond between my wife Tori and I and that couple. Anytime we're in town, we go visit them. So
that's awesome.
it wasn't just a free gift, a very generous free gift, but we connected with them, and as we got to know them, we learned that they're kind of alone. Their family's kind of scattered, and they can't travel
Right.
anymore. So
Yeah.
we feel like they're
Which,
family to us, and
yeah, that's
it's just wonderful. So anyway, anytime I
wonderful.
played on Central's orchestra, it was that horn, that very horn.
That horn, is that right? I
Yeah,
never knew that story.
yeah.
That's amazing.
And
And
so,
I do think some of God's best live at Maranatha. They've lived
oh
fruitful lives.
yes,
Some of them have opened up nations for the gospel. Some of
yes,
them
absolutely,
pastored great churches, or just been great, faithful church people. And
that's right.
they're wonderful people. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can't say thank you enough for being here. I have one last question just to
Yeah.
end things on a lighter note.
Sure.
Can you recall a funny or embarrassing moment throughout your years of ministry, perhaps from behind the pulpit, or perhaps some kind of production, or perhaps some decision that didn't quite uh,
Yeah.
iron out the way you thought? A lot of our pastors have a lot of those, and it's hard for them
Yeah.
to choose one to
I know.
select.
Yeah. So one that comes to mind when I was pastoring the University Church in Minneapolis. We were maybe 350 people, but mainly we're all college students or recent graduates. So the whole church was a young adult church. And so at some point, a lot of them were kind of getting together, getting engaged, getting married. So I did this one particular wedding with this couple in the church that were well known. They were leaders in the church, and a wonderful couple. And it was in this beautiful chapel they had rented on the campus of Northwest University. Uh, and uh, and so I get to the end, and I remember thinking, I always say at the end, after I pronounce them husband and wife, what therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder.
Right.
And I thought, I know these people so well. And the chapel was full. I thought, I'm just going to look them in the eye. I'm not going to read it this time. I'm just going to look them in the eye.
Oh no.
And the words came out backwards. What therefore God has put
Oh
asunder,
no.
let no man join together. And I go, oh no. And my first thought was, as usual, I hope most people out there were tuning the pastor out completely. But the whole place, it was packed full of people, and the whole place erupted in laughter.
Of course, they paid attention to that.
I felt so low. Except, so the next thing was, turn around, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. And here the bride had some handcuffs hidden under her dress. I kid you not, I hadn't even seen them, having stood right in front of them for the ceremony. And she whips out these handcuffs as soon as I introduce to you. She puts one on his hand, one on hers, lifts up her hand, his hand's kind of dangling, lifts up her hand with the handcuff and says, I finally got him. And so that was the saving
I was
moment
about
for
to
me.
say, yep,
I was thinking, okay, we've moved on.
yep,
This wedding
people
is going from bad to worse.
people may
But
have
that
forgotten
was the
what you said,
most,
right? Yeah.
yeah, exactly right. But
Yeah.
that was the most embarrassing, to get that backwards in a very beautiful, sacred moment was really embarrassing.
Oh yeah, it's happened to every pastor. No matter where they're at now, it's happened. We fumble on our words, but Pastor Jim, this has been such an honor. Thank you so much.
I've loved it. Thank you.
for
It's so good to chat with you.
being
I
on.
enjoyed this conversation very much.
I would love to have you again if our schedules line up sometime in the future.
Sure.
I will definitely jot that down. Like I said, we're still kind of getting our foothold, but maybe next time we'll do a Zoom call so that way we can actually see your face.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And so I really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Always honored. Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah.
So good to connect.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to follow Restoration Podcast on Spotify and Apple. If you're watching on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe.